Welcome back. It's great to have you with us today.
Yeah.
As a fellow curious mind, I know you're always looking for that next great topic to explore, and today we've got a truly fascinating deep dive for you.
Yeah, this is a really good one.
We are looking into the historical and textual reliability of the New Testament documents. Now, our sources for this, they're drawn from an extensive excerpt from a book by authors Norman Geisler and Frank Turek.
Right.
But here's the hook for today. They're analyzing the New Testament strictly through the lens of ancient history and textual criticism.
Which is such a different way to look at it than most people are used to.
Exactly. The mission for our deep dive today is to shortcut you, right, to being well-informed about exactly how historians evaluate ancient texts. We're talking criteria like eyewitness testimony, manuscript counts, and historical crosshairs.
Yeah, the actual forensic methods.
Right. But to be clear, right up front, and this is important, we aren't here to endorse the theological or religious viewpoints of the source material. We are not looking to take a side to preach or to, validate a specific faith.
Absolutely not.
Rather, we're treating this as a pure exploration of historical methodology. We just want to objectively unpack the really fascinating historical arguments and factual claims the authors present regarding how ancient documents are evaluated.
It's all about the data today.
Okay, let's unpack this. Starting with a concept I think most of us intuitively assume when we think about ancient history, the telephone game.
Oh, yeah. The classic telephone game.
You know the assumption. A text gets copied over and over across 2 millennia. And surely, just like whispering a message in a circle of kids, the original meaning gets completely distorted by the end. How does historical methodology actually address that assumption?
It is a very natural assumption to make. I mean, we've all played that game. But the authors point out that the transmission of the New Testament was not at all like a linear telephone game.
How so?
Well, in a telephone game, the message goes through a single line of transmission. If one person makes a mistake, the entire rest of the chain is permanently corrupted.
Right, because there's only one source for the next person.
Exactly. But textual transmission in the ancient world, particularly for these documents, functioned more like a massive spiderweb.
A spider web.
Yeah, it was a widespread multiplication of independent copies. It wasn't one person whispering to another. It was multiple people writing things down, and those documents being copied and sent to completely different geographic regions simultaneously.
Okay, so they're spreading out independently.
Right. Which brings us to textual criticism, which is essentially the science of reconstructing an original text from its surviving copies. To do that accurately, historians look for a massive volume of independent manuscripts. What's fascinating here is the sheer scale of the raw data.
Give us the numbers.
At last count, there are nearly 5,700 handwritten Greek manuscripts of the New Testament.
Wow.
And if you add in other ancient languages like Syriac, Coptic, and Latin, that number jumps to over 15,000 manuscripts.
That sounds like a massive number, but context is everything, right? If you're a historian looking at antiquity, how does that number actually compare to other well-known historical texts? Do we just have thousands of copies of everything from back then?
Not even close. The authors provide a really striking comparison to ground those numbers. If you look at Homer's Iliad, which is the next closest ancient work in terms of manuscript support, it has just 643 surviving manuscripts.
Just 643.
Right. Yet secular historians rarely doubt the events or the existence of the Iliad, or consider the historical footprint of actual people.
Like who?
Well, if we look at mentions by non-Christian authors within 150 years of Jesus' life, Jesus is mentioned by 10 different non-Christian authors. Tiberius Caesar, who was the reigning Roman emperor at the time, literally the most powerful man in the known world, is only mentioned by 9 non-Christian sources in that exact same time frame.
That is wild.
It really puts the textual footprint into perspective.
But going back to the manuscripts for a second, even with 5,700 Greek copies, I mean, a skeptic could say, sure, you have a lot of copies, but if they were all written hundreds of years after the fact, they're still basically legends.
A completely fair point.
So how do historians close the gap between when the events supposedly happened and when our earliest copies show up?
That is the timeline gap, and it's a critical metric for historians. For something like the Iliad, the gap between the original writing and the earliest surviving copy is about 500 years.
5 centuries.
Yeah. And most other ancient works have gaps of 1,000 years or more. But for the New Testament, we have the John Rylands fragment, which dates to between AD 117 and 138.
Okay.
We also have disputed fragments found with the Dead Sea Scrolls that paleographers, those are experts who study the evolution of ancient handwriting styles, to date documents they placed, those between AD 50 and 70.
So what does that mean for the gap?
This means the gap between the original writings and the earliest surviving copies of the New Testament is about 25 years.
25 years compared to 500.
Exactly. But the real insight here isn't just the sheer number or the short gap, it's the concept of cross-checking. Historians love having thousands of early, geographically scattered copies because it allows them to triangulate the original text.
Sort of like comparing witness statements.
Yeah, it's like having thousands of photographs of a car crash from different angles. Even if some photos are slightly blurry, the aggregate overlapping data reveals the true picture with incredible accuracy.
But wait, history is messy. What happens if someone intentionally tries to wipe out that historical record?
It happens.
Right, because the source text mentions the Roman Emperor Diocletian. Around AD 303, he basically tried to wipe Christianity off the map and issued these empire-wide edicts to destroy all Christian texts.
He did.
If a book-burning campaign like that was successful, wouldn't that leave a massive unfillable hole in the historical record? How do historians get around a literal empire-wide destruction of the primary sources?
It's a great question, and it highlights another layer of historical cross-checking, quotation. Yeah. Even if Diocletian had been 100% successful and burned every single physical biblical manuscript on Earth, we would still have the writings of the early church fathers.
Who were they?
These were leaders writing letters and commentaries in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, and they quoted the New Testament texts in their own personal correspondence so extensively, over 36,000 times, to be exact, that modern scholars could essentially rebuild the entire New Testament from their secondary quotes alone.
You're kidding.
No, they would be missing only 11 verses.
That is incredible. Okay, so the sheer volume of the text is robust, to say the least. But that brings us to the actual dating of the original texts themselves. It's one thing to have accurate copies of a document, but how do historians figure out when the very first original was actually penned?
This requires looking for internal historical markers, specifically a tool called the argument from silence. The authors of our source argue that most of the New Testament was written very early, before AD 70, and they deduce this by looking at what the text doesn't mention.
Right, and they use a really helpful analogy to explain how this historiographical tool works in practice.
It's a great analogy.
Yeah. Imagine you're reading a detailed history book about the naval fleet at Pearl Harbor, but the book ends without ever mentioning the attack on December 7th. Or imagine reading a comprehensive history of the New York City skyline, and it just stops, never once mentioning the tragedy of 9/11.
You'd immediately know something was up.
Right. You wouldn't need a publication date printed on the inside cover to know exactly when those books were written. You would immediately know they were written before those tragedies occurred, because an author documenting those specific subjects simply wouldn't omit something of that magnitude.
Precisely. And in the Jewish world of the 1st century, the equivalent of those events, but arguably even more culturally, economically, and religiously devastating, was the destruction of Jerusalem and the Jewish temple by the Romans in AD 70.
That was the center of their world.
It was the absolute center of their national and religious identity. The entire sacrificial system ended abruptly. Yet the New Testament documents continually describe the city of Jerusalem and the temple as if they are still standing and fully operational.
Does they just leave it out?
From this glaring silence, the authors conclude the texts absolutely must predate the AD 70 destruction.
But is it just a general silence? Or can historians use this method to date specific books? Take the Book of Acts, for example. It's presented as this detailed historical account of the early church.
Acts is a perfect case study for this. It tracks the life of the Apostle Paul in granular detail, but it ends incredibly abruptly.
How does it end?
Paul is simply under house arrest in Rome waiting for his trial.
That's it.
That's it. But history independently tells us, through secular Roman records, that Paul was executed by the Emperor Nero around AD 68.
Oh, I see where this is going.
Right. So if Acts is a biography that leaves its main character alive and waiting for a trial that we know resulted in his death, it must have been written before he died. That firmly places the writing of Acts before AD 68, likely around AD 62.
I suppose a skeptic might ask, well, couldn't the end of the scroll just have been lost? Or maybe the author just got bored and stopped writing.
You could argue that, but then you have to look at the prequel.
The prequel.
Yeah, the Book of Acts is part 2 of a 2-part work. The Gospel of Luke was written by the same author as Volume 1. So if Part 2, Acts, is firmly dated to AD 62, then Volume 1, Luke, must have been written even earlier.
Wow.
The implication here is massive for historians. We are talking about documents composed within a single generation of the events they describe, while the contemporaries, the hostile witnesses, and the actual eyewitnesses were still alive and walking around, fully capable of corroborating or refuting the claims.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because it's not just about the macro timeline of when they were written. It's about the astonishing level of granular geographical and political detail inside the texts.
The micro details.
Exactly. I mean, if I try to write a historical fiction novel about 18th century France right now, I'm probably going to mess up the street names or the obscure titles of regional mayors.
And that is exactly what historians test for. The source references the work of classical historian Colin Heimer, who meticulously analyzed the last 16 chapters of the Book of Acts. Heimer identified 84 historically confirmed facts in those chapters alone.
84 facts.
And these aren't broad strokes, like saying Rome had a big army. We're talking about highly specific, localized details that a later fiction writer living in a different century simply wouldn't know.
Give us some examples of those details. What exactly did Heimer find?
He verified things like the correct wind directions for specific, obscure Mediterranean sailing routes during certain times of the year.
That's incredibly specific.
He verified the proper local slang used in distinct, isolated towns. He checked the exact depths of the water off the coast of Malta, which matched the text perfectly. He also found that the author used highly obscure, highly specific titles for local magistrates in different Roman provinces.
And those titles changed a lot, right?
They changed frequently and were notoriously difficult to keep track of unless you were actually there.
And it isn't just the Book of Acts, right? The authors point out that the Gospel of John has the same kind of forensic footprint.
Yes, the source lists 59 historically confirmed or highly probable details in the Gospel of John. For instance, the author knew the exact distance from Bethany to Jerusalem, which is less than 2 miles.
Okay.
The text also correctly describes the Pool of Bethesda as having exactly 5 colonnades. For centuries, critics thought this was a metaphorical or fabricated structure because no one had ever seen it.
Because it was destroyed.
Exactly. It was completely destroyed in AD 70. It wasn't until the 20th century that archaeologists finally excavated the site and found the pool exactly as described, with exactly 5 colonnades.
That is incredible. And the authors use a specific phrase for this, right? They call it putting historical crosshairs on an account. It's one thing to say once upon a time in a faraway land, but it's entirely different to name names.
Exactly. The New Testament names at least 30 historically confirmed public figures. From a historical perspective, it is incredibly risky for an author to include real, powerful, living people in a fabricated story.
Because you get caught immediately.
Right. If you make up a lie and include the current governor's name in it, you are inviting immediate authoritative contradiction.
What's wild is that modern archaeology just keeps backing these names up.
It really does.
For a long time, skeptics actually doubted that Pontius Pilate was a real governor in Judea because there was no secular record of him. But then, in 1961, archaeologists digging in Caesarea found a stone inscription literally bearing his name and his title, Prefect of Judea.
Yep.
Or take the high priest Caiaphas, the man who the texts say organized the plot against Jesus.
The Caiaphas discovery is fascinating. In 1990, workers building a water park in Jerusalem accidentally uncovered an ancient burial cave.
A water park.
I know. Inside, archaeologists found an ornate bone box, an ossuary, which was a specific type of burial container used by first-century Jews. The inscription on the side read, Joseph, son of Caiaphas.
Wow.
Inside were the actual bones of a 60-year-old man from the first century. So historians don't just have written references to this biblical figure, they literally have his physical remains.
Okay, so we have early dating, raw manuscript volume, and geographical accuracy. But the authors also bring up a psychological tool that historians use to evaluate the truthfulness of a document, the principle of embarrassment. Let's unpack that.
The principle of embarrassment is a crucial tool in historiography. The logic is rooted in basic human nature.
How so?
If you are inventing a heroic myth, or if you are trying to start a brand new religious movement where you are the leader, you do not invent details that make yourself or your revered founders look terrible.
And if you look at the texts through that lens, the writers included some deeply, deeply embarrassing details about themselves.
Oh, absolutely.
They depict the disciples, the very founders of the movement, as bumbling, clueless cowards. In the darkest hour of the narrative, Jesus' followers literally fall asleep on him.
Not a great look.
Peter, who is supposed to be the bold, fearless rock of the early church, is called Satan by Jesus at one point, and later vehemently denies even knowing him 3 separate times to a servant girl.
And perhaps the most striking example of this principle for the culture of the time involves the discovery of the empty tomb. The writers unanimously report that women were the very first to discover it.
Which wouldn't be a big deal today, but back then.
You have to remember the context of first-century Judea. In that culture, a woman's testimony wasn't even admissible in a court of law. They were considered unreliable witnesses.
Right.
Furthermore, one of these women was Mary Magdalene, who the text openly admits was formerly possessed by demons.
Okay, I had to play devil's advocate here.
Go for it.
Couldn't a skeptic argue that a really clever writer would include embarrassing details, specifically to make a fake story sound more authentic? Sort of a first-century reverse psychology.
It's a fair question, but historians argue that concept doesn't fit the literary norms of the ancient world. Ancient biographies were heavily idealized. They were designed to elevate the subject and their followers.
They didn't do gritty reboots back then.
Exactly. This raises an important question. If these men were fabricating a lie from scratch to gain power, authority, and prestige in a patriarchal society, why on earth would they give their cultural enemies such easy ammunition?
It makes no sense.
Why make women, whose testimony carried no legal weight, the foundational bedrock witnesses to your central, most important claim? The most logical historical explanation is that they included these highly embarrassing details simply because they were stuck with the truth. They reported it because that is exactly what happened.
So let's talk about the elephant in the room when it comes to multiple accounts, the contradictions. A skeptic reads these texts and says, wait, Matthew mentions 1 angel at the empty tomb, while John mentions 2 angels. The story doesn't check out.
People say that all the time.
Right. In a modern courtroom, if 2 witnesses don't perfectly align, a jury might throw the testimony out. How does historical methodology handle that?
It's actually the exact opposite of what most people assume. The authors argue that these aren't fatal contradictions. They call them divergent details, and they argue these actually prove independent eyewitness authenticity.
How does disagreeing prove authenticity?
Think about 2 independent journalists covering a major news event, like a presidential visit. They will both agree on the core major facts: the president arrived at noon. But one journalist might focus entirely on the speech, while another might write about the protesters outside.
Right, different perspectives.
If the 4 gospel accounts were perfectly identical word for word, a historian or a judge would immediately suspect collusion. They would assume the writers got together in a back room, ironed out their story, and coordinated their lies.
So it is the agreement on the major points combined with the divergence on the minor peripheral details that signals genuine independent memory.
Exactly. And it is incredibly helpful to contrast these sober, almost dry New Testament accounts with actual proven legendary texts from antiquity.
Give us an example of a real legend.
Look at the apocryphal Gospel of Peter. This was a fabricated text written over 100 years later by someone falsely claiming to be Peter. In that story, the resurrection involves giant angels whose heads literally stretch up beyond the clouds.
That's quite the image.
It features a walking, talking cross that comes out of the tomb and answers a voice from heaven.
A talking cross.
Literally a walking, talking cross.
See, that is exactly what a made-up, embellished myth actually looks like. But the canonical Gospels just give these incredibly stark, unembellished, matter-of-fact reports. No giant angels, no talking wood, just a missing body and some confused followers.
Very grounded.
Which brings us to a massive cultural shift that the source highlights regarding human motivation. Almost overnight, thousands of devout Jews completely abandoned 1,500-year-old sacred traditions.
Which was unprecedented.
They stopped observing the strict Sabbath, they abandoned the entire animal sacrifice system, and they did this knowing it would result in immediate social excommunication, severe persecution, and possibly death.
This speaks directly to the historiographical issue of motive. A historian has to ask, why would the writers and early followers voluntarily endure torture and brutal executions for a story they knew they had just invented in a back room?
Right. What's the payoff?
As the source points out, human psychology shows us that people will die for a lie if they sincerely believe it's the truth. We see tragic examples of that throughout history. But no sane person willingly submits to torture and death for a lie that they fabricated themselves.
They had nothing to gain.
No money, no power, no prestige.
The authors of our source make an interesting sociological argument here regarding motive. specifically comparing early Christianity to other historical movements, like early Islam. Their thesis explores the difference between the types of claims the martyrs were dying for and how the movements expanded.
Right. Their sociological argument is that the early Christian martyrs were historically unique because they were dying for empirical eyewitness claims.
Physical claims.
Exactly. They weren't dying for a philosophical idea or a sincere belief in a private revelation. They were dying for something they claimed to physically see, touch, and interact with in real space and time.
And regarding the expansion.
The authors contrast this with the expansion of other faiths. They note that for its first 300 years, Christianity spread solely through testimony, despite its followers being heavily persecuted and killed by the state.
Right.
The authors contrast this with the early expansion of Islam, which they state spread largely via military conquests and state power following Muhammad's initial preaching. Again, we are looking at this strictly as a report of the author's sociological thesis regarding human motivation, historical expansion, and the unique environment of early Christian testimonies.
Exactly. We're simply putting the source's historiographical arguments on the table for you to examine. So, what does this all mean?
It's a lot to take in.
It is. When we zoom out and look at the big picture of this deep dive, the core takeaway is that the source presents a highly forensic, deeply layered historical argument. They argue that the New Testament texts aren't distant, morphing myths, but early documents.
Right.
They're independently cross-checked by thousands of manuscripts, verified by highly specific archaeological digs, filled with raw, unembellished eyewitness details, and backed by authors who gained absolute nothing but persecution for their claims.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it reminds us of the profound value of critical thinking. Whenever we approach historical documents, whether it is the New Testament, ancient Roman histories, or even modern records, applying these specific tests is crucial.
Changes how you read history.
Looking for early testimony, cross-checking, corroborating evidence, evaluating the timeline gap, and applying the principle of embarrassment, all of this helps us understand the why behind historical consensus. Knowledge isn't just about blindly accepting or rejecting a text based on our modern biases. It's about understanding the rigorous mechanics of the historical method.
And that leaves me with the final provocative thought for you to mull over today, building on something the source mentioned about oral cultures versus written copies.
This is a great point.
Think about our modern, highly documented era. We record every single second of our lives digitally. Our entire civilization is built on data, stored in the cloud. But digital data is incredibly fragile.
It really is.
It can be altered without a trace. It can be manipulated by AI, deepfaked to look perfectly real, or completely wiped out by a single corrupted server or an EMP. Apply these same historical tests to our world right now. Will historians 2,000 years from now actually have more certainty about our modern history?
That's the question.
Or will the scattered, physical, uneditable parchment copies of the ancient world end up being far more reliable to future historians than our massive, fragile digital footprint? It is definitely something to think about. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive today. We always appreciate exploring these big ideas with you. Until next time, keep questioning and keep learning.